Pablo Escobar, also known as Pablo Emilio Escobar, is considered one of the most dangerous and wealthy criminals of the 20th century. His fortune was estimated at $47 billion, and his power was considered practically limitless. Among the poor, the criminal had a respectful nickname, Doctor, despite his outward charity. Escobar was a complete sadist and murderer who stopped at nothing to achieve his goals. From his youth, Pablo Escobar was a fairly ordinary child until he became involved with one of the small gangs and became addicted to cannabis. The poor neighborhoods of Medellin, where Escobar grew up, were always a breeding ground for crime, so it's no surprise that Escobar soon became involved in criminal activity. At first, he simply stole tombstones from graves, sanded down the inscriptions, and then sold the polished obelisks to Panama. Later, Pablo Escobar began selling marijuana and forging lottery tickets. Having gained experience in petty crimes, the young man put together his own group that engaged in car theft. The owners of the vehicles were initially offered to pay for so-called protection from theft. If the driver didn't agree, his car would soon disappear forever, and the gang would either simply renumber the stolen vehicle or resell it for parts. In 1971, when Escobar's group had gained experience and become powerful enough, they took on a more profitable business, kidnapping people for ransom. Of course, they didn't kidnap the poor. In the same year, 1971, one of Colombia's most famous and wealthy industrialists, Diego Echevarria, disappeared. After failing to get a ransom from his relatives, Escobar's bandits, after several days of torture, simply strangled the unfortunate man and dumped his body in a landfill. Interestingly, the poor welcomed the rich man's death, immediately calling Escobar Doctor. This was also due to the fact that, while killing and robbing the rich and well-off citizens, Escobar always helped the poor, believing that they were suffering unjustly. In fact, the criminal took on the role of Robin Hood of the 20th century. However, despite such an outwardly positive aura, what Escobar was doing was beyond comprehension. At the age of 22, having become one of the most authoritative criminals, Escobar began supplying cocaine to the United States. At first, he simply bribed officials, but then he began direct production. He came to this thanks to endless wars with competitors from other drug cartels. Escobar's bandits ruthlessly destroyed, kidnapped, and tortured. This soon had its effect. Pablo Escobar became practically the undisputed king of the cocaine industry in Colombia. The drug was sent to the United States by all possible means, including even delivery by submarines. Cocaine plantations and laboratories were created throughout the country in the jungles, and a whole army of hired killers kept order. Later, Escobar simply provided delivery of goods to the states, taking a 35% commission from the cocaine producers on the amount of the shipment. 6 years later, in 1977, having joined forces with other drug traffickers, Escobar created the world's largest cocaine cartel, the Medellin Cocaine Cartel. Using his unreal financial resources, Escobar actively bought government officials, police chiefs, and judges. At the same time, as part of maintaining his Robin Hood image, Pablo built entire neighborhoods for the poor, which were called Pablo Escobar's neighborhoods. But despite all this, the atrocities of the drug king surpassed all imaginable limits. After marrying a teenage girl, Escobar became very passionate about other teenage girls. Escobar's special people would search the poorest neighborhoods and then bring the young beauties to their master to participate in parties. However, the fate of the unfortunate girls was not as rosy as it might seem. Only in 1991 were the bodies of 24 girls found who had been killed after one of these parties. So Escobar was not such a Robin Hood after all, especially since the numerous intimidation campaigns carried out by the drug lord very often affected innocent people. In 1984, Justice Minister Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was shot dead, who put an end to Escobar's political ambitions. He dreamed of becoming almost the president of Colombia, starting with the post of senator. When the United States and Colombia agreed that all drug lords would be extradited to the United States for sentencing, Escobar organized real terror for each of his colleagues who was extradited. All those who directly or indirectly supported the fight against drugs were destroyed. Officials, journalists, police officers. Among the most high-profile murders was the death of Supreme Court Justice Carlos Valencia on August 16, 1989. A day after the death of politician Luis Carlos Galen, the election campaign in Colombia was marked by dozens of people killed and injured every day. All those whom Escobar considered a problem, current or future, were eliminated. In just 2 weeks, as a result of the terrorist acts of the drug lord Escobar, 37 people were killed, and at least 400 were injured, including people who had nothing to do with either politics or drugs. The peak of madness was November 1989, when on Escobar's orders, a passenger plane was blown up, which was supposed to carry the elected president of Colombia, Cesar Gaviria Trujillo. 107 innocent people died. The president himself canceled the flight at the last moment, thanks to which he survived. Further intimidation of the authorities only exacerbated the situation. Trying to destroy the head of the secret police, Miguel Mazo Marquez, the militants staged an explosion on December 6, 1989, which killed 62 people. More than 100 more were injured, and again innocent people died. But apparently those whom the drug lord supposedly so zealously protected were increasingly becoming ordinary, expendable material. On January 30, 1993, on Escobar's orders, an act of intimidation was carried out that made even many of the poor reconsider their attitude towards him. A bomb exploded, killing 21 people and injuring at least 70 more. The horror of the situation was that children and parents who had come to a bookstore were killed and injured. It was after this terrorist act that local residents created the organization Los Pepes, whose members were those who themselves suffered from Escobar's actions or lost relatives. Strangely enough, it was not law enforcement, but this very association that became the beginning of the end for Escobar. Los Pepes burned down his mother's estate several times, made several attempts to kill the drug lord, and began to persecute his family. Coupled with massive operations by the Colombian government and the war started by a rival clan of drug traffickers, Escobar was practically cornered. Many of his supporters went over to the competition. Some were in prison, and Pablo himself, having practically lost all his savings, was forced to go into hiding. But on December 3rd of the same year, 1993, during an operation to capture the drug lord, Pablo Escobar was killed. Despite the fact that many of the poor mourned and cried at his funeral, most were happy that the madness of the Escobar era had come to an end. Suffice it to say that in 1989 alone, during the presidential elections in the same Medellin, more than 2,500 people were killed in a year, and the city itself was under the complete control of drug traffickers. The testimony of John Jairo Velasquez, Escobar's best hitman, is indicative. In court, he testified that he personally gave orders to kill more than 3,000 people. Velasquez himself confessed to 300 murders. For example, when the mother of one of Pablo's friends got off a passenger bus, she was hit by a car. Despite the fact that the driver was not to blame, Escobar decided to comfort his friend by ordering the driver to be shot. There were dozens, if not hundreds, of such cases of reprisals against completely random people. Hired killers in Escobar's army were also trained on innocent civilians, young guys from the poorest neighborhoods. At first, they were carefully trained, and then they were given their first exam. The graduate had to drive up to a car on a motorcycle and shoot the driver, and the driver's identity didn't matter to anyone. It was thanks to these schools in Colombia that an entire class of sicarios emerged, children who were practically trained from a very young age to be hired killers. Naturally, when the drug lord's empire collapsed, these sicarios continued to kill simply to make a living. Therefore, when the drug lord is made almost a paragon of virtue and a fighter against the authorities, it is worth remembering the dead children, the hundreds of maimed and killed random passers-by, the victims of the plane crash, and the dozens of teenage girls whose bodies, many of whom were never found. And as further confirmation that everyone was tired of Escobar and his bloody madness, the following fact can serve. The drug lord's own brother worked for the National Drug Enforcement Agency. This was later written by Escobar's son, Juan Sebastian Marroquin Santos. My uncle Roberto Escobar was an official informant for the DEA and actively helped Pablo's enemies. And it was not only Roberto who did this, but also his brothers and sisters, and even his own mother.